Good morning, and for those of you who are maybe watching this on demand, we're just waiting on the participants joining the webinar. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. There are a few of you on the line and ready to get started. I see from the chat box already, many of you are looking forward to this webinar. I am too. I've just posted a question in the comments or in the chat box. Just maybe like to get an understanding. I know many of you are really looking forward to this, and it would be good to have an understanding about maybe what has brought you to this. In other words, maybe it might be, what do you want to get from this? And I'll try and bear that in mind as I'm running through the session. Okay, so thanks already. Some suggestions there in the chat box, which is, yes, some time out of the business to think about leadership rather than being in the business. So it's the working on and the working in scenario there as well. So a few more people joining us now. Many of you will know that this webinar is available on demand, and so that everybody that's signed up may not necessarily be attending, as they perhaps will watch the recording. It's 11:02 by me at the moment, so I'm just going to give it one more minute before we get started. Morning, Muriel, and welcome. Okay, so it is 11:03, and as those of you are here on time, I will get started, and anybody else can join us as we progress. So good morning and welcome to this webinar on how to lead through uncertainty to build thriving, meaningful organisations. That may sound like a bit of a tough challenge in the environment that we exist within today. But there are some things that you can do, taking action from today, to help you to lead through uncertainty and to create those really thriving and meaningful organisations. That is key. So before I get started, for those of you who haven't been on Crowdcast before, what you'll see at the bottom of your screen is ask a question. So if you do have any questions, please include those questions in there. You'll see the chat box down the right-hand side. We're already starting to use that. I'll try to keep my eye on that as I proceed. You'll also see at the bottom of the screen something saying polls. So there are two polls that I'm going to conduct through the webinar. It'll be interesting just to see your responses to those. So I'm just going to change the screen view as we get started here, so that you can see the slides more clearly. And what we want to do today is to talk about some of the key things that are going to help us lead through that uncertainty. Before I get started, I suppose for those of you who don't know me, what you want to know is, well, perhaps what gives me the right to be here and to be providing that information. So I am a business improvement specialist with over 20 years experience. I have a master's in business improvement. I'm also a chartered member of the Institute of Personnel and Development. I provide strategic planning services for many of the charities, and so I have great experience in that area. I also provide those skills to improve psychological flexibility. I'm a certified ACT trainer, that's acceptance commitment training, and I'm also a certified ACT matrix facilitator with Dr. Kevin Polk, the creator of the ACT matrix. Kevin also created the pro-social matrix, and so I use it to create psychologically safe workplaces. Again, maybe even today when we're talking about leading through uncertainty, it's impossible not to talk about creating psychological safety. I really do believe that in terms of organisational culture, that is particularly key moving forward and leading in this uncertain world. And also very relevant in terms of what I'm going to talk about today is the emotional intelligence. And I'm also licensed to provide the Thomas International TQ Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire. So that's the Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire. So that's a little bit about me, but to move on in terms of the session and what we're going to cover. So the key areas of focus here in terms of leading through uncertainty to create those thriving, meaningful organisations. What I want to do is to talk about the trends and changes likely to impact on the workforce. So what is it that you need to consider as a leader? The steps required to bring the organisation back to healthy levels of performance. So what I'm going to do is share with you a lot of the research that has now been produced in that area. And also what I'm going to do is talk about then the leadership skills and behaviours that are required to succeed in the future. Clearly, we would know that there has been a shift over recent years, but I think the shift is accelerated with some of those skills and behaviours. So if we start with some of the trends and think about, so what has changed in organisations and in the workplace? Well, there has been a lot of radical change, most of that very positive. And the radical change has been for organisations to consider how work gets done and what can we do to accomplish that. So what work needs to be done and how do we provide and deliver that. So in terms of that radical change, some of the things that have happened is decision making has accelerated at quite a rapid pace. Those things that may have required decisions to be taken over a period of time have been made very quickly. I can think of some of the organisations that I worked with just as lockdown was starting. Some of those changes may have looked as if they would have taken months, and some of those changes occurred within days. Agility is the ability for the organisation to change and to adapt. And if we consider, well, thousands or millions of people around the world move to remote working overnight. The agility to respond also to customer needs. So the agility and the innovation is, if we consider innovation, particularly I think of the people in the fitness world, so gyms certainly closed overnight and people thought about, well, how can we bring what we do into people's homes? And so we find now that fitness is live streaming into people's homes or again available on demand. So all of this has been enabled through the accelerated digitalization and technological advances. We are all using technology that we may have not used before. Today, I hear people talk about being zoomed out. And so I think that's another thing to consider in terms of leading in uncertainty is what is possible? How can I lead my organization effectively and to avoid the being zoomed out? Virtual working is certainly a huge population of people in workforces around the world were working from home. And what we've found is that organizations have been partnering with competitors, something that perhaps for some would never have happened before. So how can we work together? So if we think about the pandemic and those organizations creating vaccines, they're working together to try to create this vaccine, because what is their purpose in life? Their purpose in life as an organization is to save lives. And if they can't do that on their own, then partnering with organizations perhaps is more helpful. So those are some of the things that I believe have changed. And what I'd like you to do is, if you maybe just could look at the first poll and just select out of that list there what you believe has changed for you in recent months. So I'll just give you a couple of moments there to have a look at the list. So you'll see that at the bottom of your screens. Thanks, I can see some of you starting to populate that. Okay, so yeah, so the top three coming up at the moment are what's changed for you is the decision making having to be much more rapid, agility, and virtual working. So those are the two things that have changed for you to this point. The question now is, well, what will the future look like? And so in terms of the future, what we have here is some research. Again, the source here is Fast Company. So there are 5 changes to expect in the workforce after COVID-19. So if we start with the full digital transformation supported by a truly virtual workforce. Even just in terms of the truly virtual workforce, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development have this week released some of their survey results, which suggests that home working now is set to double. And what they say is while that may have been 1 in 5 before the pandemic, 2 in 5 at least will now be working from home on a continual basis. But outside of the continual basis, I think what we will find is we will find now more people wanting to work from home because people have been doing it. People find the benefit of that. So the full digital transformation is, while we've talked about the world of digitalization, we haven't really fully grasped that before. And while I suppose some of us might have felt that our health service perhaps was a little bit outdated in terms of what it did and how it did it, if we think about now, maybe any of you who have had to access your doctor over recent months, you'll find now that they may be doing video calls with you as well as telephone calls. So what we find there is that's certainly helped. And I've also talked about the full transformation or the digital transformation in terms of the gym. So maybe people finding it's not just as easy to leave the home and to go to the gym, but gym membership could be provided through that online streaming service. So those are things that are definitely set to stay. And the other one there is the focus on outputs versus the face time. So pre-lockdown, I think we all existed in this world where we had to be present in work to show that we were productive. So that may have meant going into the office early. It may have been staying and work late. Well, really now what we've found, because we are all working from home, it's not about the quantity that we put in, the amount of hours that we're putting in, but it's the outputs that are important in any workforce. It's about delivering on results. And so really in terms of the workplace, well, what that will mean is that will mean people need to understand what the expectations are and that there is a focus on those outputs. People understand what those might be. So I think if we move even into the respect for the work-life blend, what we have found during the pandemic is that the normal 9 to 5 hours of working perhaps don't work anymore. And so certainly I know of couples who, in terms of having children at home and homeschooling, made the decision that perhaps one would work in the morning and one would work in the afternoon. And they may then also be able to alter that into the evenings. And so really there has been a greater respect for the work-life balance, the understanding of people's well-being, and that's going to stay in the future. So even in terms of that work-life blend, we have all now got to know people's children's, everyone perhaps some sessions and Zoom meetings where people's children have appeared on screen. So we've all got to know people's families. We can see into people's homes. Before lockdown, people wanted to keep all of that perhaps very private. They didn't want people to see into their homes. And so all of those lines have become a little bit blurred. But that blend is certainly very important. And even that work-life blend is the importance moving forward of the need to look at self-care. And that's both for leaders and for those people in the organisation. How do we respect that work-life blend and respect the need for self-care? In fact, how do we even promote that? What we find is during lockdown, there was increased frequency of communication being much more effective because of the channels that we were using and the frequency of using those. That's set to stay. And we need to think about the communications in terms of the decision making. So what information do people need to be able to be more decisive? How can we really empower people to make those decisions, that it isn't the leader that's required all the time to make those decisions? And one of the things, again, is the increased trust, transparency, and empathy. So the need to be much more open and honest about perhaps what we can do and what we can't do, to be transparent about the situation that the organisation is in. And again, even some research has been done with the Fortune 500 companies, and two things came out of that in terms of CEOs. And so there is a need now moving forward for humility and listening for change leaders. So as to really listen, to be present in conversations, to put yourself in people's positions and to consider those. And so those things aren't necessarily new. It's just they've come more to the front. So any of you who have read books by Brené Brown, who has been talking about vulnerability in leadership, is really showing vulnerability, because we can't expect our people to show vulnerability if we don't as leaders. And also Amy Edmondson, in terms of the candor and the psychological flexibility, the psychological safety within the workforce. So those are behaviours that has been identified for a number of years, but the accelerated development of those is very evident, and that is going to continue. So those are things that you as leaders want to consider about, how could I go about developing my skills in terms of trust and transparency and empathy? What conversations do we need to have with our people in terms of the respect for the work-life blend? It is about having conversations again about those key performance indicators that you have. Are those really outcome focused, or are they activity focused? And what digital platforms would be helpful for us? What do we need to invest in to make the organisation transform and to allow for the virtual working? And how can that also help in terms of the digital transformation in terms of those communication channels? So in terms of moving forward and the steps required, the research conducted by Corn Ferry, there is a document about accelerating through the turn. And the steps required moving forward in terms of leadership, the first one there is purpose. Those of you that know me, have spent some time even in terms of developing strategy, will know that I have always talked about purpose rather than mission. So many organisations have mission statements. Those mission statements are on websites and they're on office walls. Often when I get involved and I start to look at organisations and talk about what might be on the website in terms of the mission, some may have forgotten what that says. It may be outdated. And so the purpose, why do we exist as an organisation? What value do we intend to create for our customers is really crucial moving forward in this world in terms of being a meaningful organisation for our customers. So why do we exist? What value do we provide to our customers? And when we create that purpose, so what we might say at the moment is we might need to review our purpose. We might need to remind people of what our purpose is. Because what is essential is that the people that work for you understand what the purpose is, how it creates value, and how we do our work. So how do we work to create that purpose? What that means is that means talking about your purpose in meetings. So, that might be a question for you is how often do we refer back to our purpose? Because the purpose helps in the decision making, and that will accelerate the decision making when we look at it. Is this something we should do or not? Does it help us achieve our purpose and create that value for our customers? And if it does, we do it. And if it doesn't, then we shouldn't. So really looking at that meaningful customer-centric purpose is the critical first step, because everything else is going to fall from it or be aligned to it. So in the past, we've had strategic plans developed. I've talked about the work that I would do in terms of strategic planning. For some organisations, that might take 3 or 4, 5, 6 months to develop that strategic plan. In today's world, during and post the pandemic, we're not going to have the time to do that. So the strategic planning process is going to be replaced by business priorities. And those business priorities will be much shorter term in terms of what it is we're trying to, what those priorities are. Because those will change perhaps quite rapidly. I'm going to talk about purpose and business priorities as well, just in terms of leadership and development. Again, some of these aren't necessarily new concepts in terms of the change in the purpose and the business priorities. Those of you that are interested, a good read is Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. Reinventing Organizations is about the organizational structure. It's looking at evolutionary purpose and self-managed teams. So again, the focus for what would be called an organizational structure. Teal organizations, which is a specific way of operating. Teal organizations will not have strategic plans. They will have priorities that they focus on. This will enable organizations to be much more agile. So think about, in terms of our business priorities, what are those at the moment? For some, that may be cost cutting, but cost cutting must consider what is our organizational purpose. Will we be able to deliver on the organizational purpose while we cost cut? Organizational capabilities then, those are the systems, the tools, the structures, the skills, the behaviours required in the organization to achieve that organizational purpose. So, even if we're thinking about the organizational capabilities, then what are the behaviours? What is the structure? You'll look at the organization very differently if you put the purpose at the heart of all of these things. So even in terms of organizational capabilities, if we consider things like the leadership, the organization, and people, well, leadership has changed because leadership at the moment requires managing virtual teams. And while some of you at the moment might have a mix of working with people in office and outside, so we've got to be careful there that we don't create an imbalance, that work goes more to those people in the office as opposed to the virtual working, because people are key in the organization, and that is what we've found. So capabilities in today's workforce include even the well-being. I talked earlier about self-care. So what are the skills and abilities that our people need to achieve that purpose? We need our people to look after themselves. How can we help and support them to be able to do that? We need to consider not only the skills and abilities, but the support packages that we might have to do that. So do we provide health and well-being benefits? And if not, then we need to be able to find some way of doing that. So leadership as well is, if we think about leadership, the redefining and upskilling in organisations those jobs that are required to achieve the purpose. Some research again that has been done identified that 34% of chief executives rate this as one of their biggest threats, is the ability to skill and upskill and redefine jobs. So that has to be a real key priority in terms of organisational structure. I talked about the reinventing organisations. Reinventing organisations, self-managed teams in those organisations could have thousands. I mean, one organisation in the healthcare sector has over 10,000 employees. It's a self-managed organisation. There are no bosses. There are work coaches, but we operate today on the basis that in some cases that leadership is power. Leaders are the people that make the decisions. Decisions need to be made by engaging everybody in the organisation. It's about finding out people's views and opinions, because those people working in your organisations understand what your customers are telling them. They know what is working and what isn't. So we've got to consider that. Because sometimes as leaders, we can be removed a little bit from the front line. So fully understanding all of that is critical. And workforce planning and analytics. Well, the nature of agility requires us to have good analytics. So if we're going to respond quickly, we need to have good analytics about the organisation and about our people. So those are things in terms of business priorities and those analytics and metrics and measurements. How do we do that? Do we have the system? So we're back to digitalization, that we're not preparing information manually, that we can run reports that enable us to very quickly respond in the moment to what is going on, and that we don't miss those opportunities. So that's some research in terms of next steps from Korn Ferry. I'll also just show you here, this is McKinsey and Company. Their research is very much the same, might say presented differently. So who we are in the middle is our purpose, the value that we provide to our customers, and also the culture. So back to purpose again, purpose being critical. What is our purpose? What is it we exist to do? If we refocus on that and we provide what it is our customers want in a way that our customers want, then people will come to us. We will lose customers if we don't do that. So the who we are in the middle, and then how we operate and how we grow. So the darker blue being how we operate, and that's looking at our decisions, the platforms that we use, the ecosystems, and the learning. So even in terms of the ecosystems, that is something that is critical in terms of the healthy levels of performance. So what is the network that we exist within? One of the things that we have found during the pandemic is that the networks, many organizations did not place enough value on their supply chain. So who is supplying us and how are they supplying us? Perhaps if we look at even China, so we might have found that in terms of suppliers that there was a slowdown in our supply chain or a stop to our supply chain if some of our products were coming from a distance. So what is the network that we exist within? Within the ecosystems, one of the key things that's come out is the community that we exist within. The community that we exist within, we might have talked about social responsibility before, but we do need to consider the community that we exist within, because we could be responsible for the transmission of the virus within our community. We need to consider what is going on in the community and have respect for what is going on in the community. So we even come to the topic of face masks that we hear today is, we might need to consider that perhaps we are telling our staff that face masks coming in and out of the building is compulsory, so that we are setting an example to those people around us. So platforms, the technological platforms that we've talked about, learning. What have we learned? I think one of the key things in terms of learning moving forward is to be having conversations with the people that you work with about what has worked and what hasn't. So you've made huge changes to how you work and what you do. But we need to take a step back now and reflect and be asking people those questions about what's worked and what didn't and why. Because I think the why is also important, in what worked and what didn't. So taking the time to do that, and as a leader being truly present, trying not to take our own prejudices to those conversations about what you believe worked and what won't work in the future, that we go with an open mind. And so even in terms of the talent and the structure and the decisions in terms of how we operate, then those are some of the things that I've already talked about when I looked at the Corn Ferry model. So thinking about your organisational structure, does it really work for us? What I have seen in recent months is organisations taking action on structure now that they knew needed to be taken with before, but perhaps fear and perhaps trying to get on with the job that we had to do delayed that. Those decisions are now being made, and organisations are creating much flatter structures, much more relevant structures to be able to deliver on the purpose. And also in terms of the people, I've seen organisations making changes in terms of people in structure and reorganising. Is what talent do we need moving forward? So if we might need new people in different positions. There will be positions now that will become much more relevant and much more valuable to organisations because the way they help create the purpose. So one thing in terms of all of that I wanted to signpost you to is what we know is innovation has been critical, and we know that that's going to be one of the things that's critical moving forward. So thinking about organisational capability is EFQM now have a framework called the Innovation Lens, which was created here in Northern Ireland, developed by the Centre for Competitiveness, and that has been approved and is now being sold globally. This tool allows you to diagnose your organisation. So I've provided you there with the Centre for Competitiveness's website, but also there is a tool on the EFQM's website called Assess Space, which allows you to identify your current position in terms of the model, will allow you to identify your priorities moving forward to improve the capabilities for innovation. Many organisations I know do have innovation as a value in their organisation. But when we talk about purpose and value, we really need to look at, are these things that we live in the organisation? Do everything that we do, does that emphasise those values? And if not, then we need to relook at things. So if we have a focus on innovation, there's a need to continually develop the way we do things. Then what we need to do is to think about, well, how do we develop a culture of the organisation where people do innovate? And that is where I would come back to the conversation on psychological safety. If there isn't psychological safety in organisations, that is people feeling the ability to present ideas and suggestions, for example, without fear of being ridiculed, or people being able to say how they truly feel without fear of the repercussions of that. then people will not tell you what they think. Because people will think that you know as a leader, because you know better, because that's how we've set organisational structures up. Leaders are people that have all the answers, and we don't. So we need to have those conversations to ask people about what they think, how things should be done. What we're not saying is we're going to do everything that everybody says, but we do need to listen to what our people are saying. So we need to think about creating psychologically safe organisations where people feel that they can have conversations and they can be open and honest. And that will require role modelling from the leadership team. So just maybe before I move into the leadership skills and behaviours, maybe moving back to one of the polls again. There's a second poll there, which is if we looked at the 5 things that are going to stay moving forward, that pose, which of these pose the highest risk to your organisation if you aren't prepared? So just going back to that full digital transformation, focus on outputs versus the face time, respect for work-life balance, stronger communications, and increased trust, transparency, and empathy. Which of those would be the highest risk to you if you're not prepared? Just give everybody a moment. Okay, so at the moment, it's looking like the digital transformation and the increased trust, transparency, and empathy is definitely coming out as key. So if we think about leading through uncertainty to create thriving, meaningful organisations, how do we create a culture of increased trust, transparency, and empathy? And that really just brings us back to what I'm going to talk about. So if we consider here the leadership skills and behaviours, we've got to role model the trust and the empathy and the transparency. So we need to be doing that first. And that takes us to, I think, a quote that I regularly use, and that is, in the past, jobs were about muscles, but now they're about brains, and in the future, they'll be about heart. Well, I think about having used this quote before the pandemic and think about this now. We've definitely moved to the heart because we're talking about caring organisations. We've been empathetic with our employees. We've changed as leaders how we interact with our people. And we need to develop those skills because it might be some of us have been forced into having some of these conversations and behaving in different ways because of the situation. But if we move back to what might have been our normal environment in the workplace, it could be easy to go back to the way we were. So we do need to think about what are the leadership skills and behaviours that are required to move from the muscles to the brains to the heart. Because heart being critical, if we think about the Fast Company research in terms of what's going to stay, the need to be more empathetic, the need for humility, the need for listening, there is a shift in terms of how we lead. And I talk about a shift in terms of how we lead. There has been pre-pandemic a discussion about soft skills. And are soft skills soft, or should they be referred to as power skills? So we often refer to some of those skills that are required in the organisation being soft skills. The hard skills being those skills required to be able to do the job, the technical skills. And one of the things, the debate around this is, well, one of the things that we know is the hard skills are the skills that we can learn, we can in some ways, easily learn those. The soft skills are harder to develop, and they are the most critical now moving forward for organisations to succeed and to lead through uncertainty. So those are the skills required for change. And therefore, maybe if we consider these as power skills, the skills that we really require in the organisation that will power us through into the future. And so these are some of the power skills. This debate comes from John Bershan. Any of the, if you want some more information, feel free to Google that. So here we have things, the empathy popping up in the middle of this matrix, flexibility being key, forgiveness, kindness, patience, ethics. And many of these skills are things that we may have talked about, perhaps fleetingly. But what I'd encourage you to do now is to be picking out maybe 3 or 4 power skills here for you as a leader, for your leadership teams that you need to develop. And perhaps then to create a focus on one of those at a time in the organisation, developing activities around those so that you start to embed and develop those skills, not only in the leadership team, but across the organisation. So the focus on innovation, if we think about that focus, one of the other ones that I want to mention just is curiosity. So if we're going to be truly innovative organisations, then as leaders, we need to be curious. And so that's about the listening, the asking the questions. So I see a key leadership skill is definitely curiosity. All of those are very relevant in terms of the world that we live in. And many of you may know that those were things that we were talking about in the future. But if we're going to drive the organisation, accelerate through the changes that we need to make, then we really need to focus on those. So what I'd suggest also is perhaps looking at your organisational values and assessing which of these power skills are critical that fit with the values. So all along, aligning back to the purpose and the values, your leadership, your skills, your structure, and your capabilities. So again, on this theme, in terms of the leadership behaviours, just looking at the poll, we've identified that one of the critical issues was about the empathy and the trust and the transparency is Corn Ferry have identified these were the new behaviours emerging from the crisis that will be critical in terms of what they call accelerating through the turn. So decisiveness, we know decisions were made much quicker than before. So what we need to do is to consider what is the structure in the organisation for making decisions? What is the process? Could we re-engineer that? What information do people need to be able to be more decisive? Thinking about how we provide that information. Agility, again, is, well, we talked about thousands of people being able to work from home. So in terms of agility, unfortunately, the thought is this is not the only pandemic that is going to hit. So how responsive can we be in the future? So again, earlier I talked about the analytics. So if we look at the analytics, how quickly can we change and adapt as an organisation dependent on what the analytics tell us? How can we create new services quickly if there is a need and a demand? And that fits with our purpose. Collaboration then is, well, you know, if I think about collaboration and we think about the ecosystems that I talked about earlier, are there competitors out there that you should be collaborating with? Who is it that you should be working with to help ensure your organisation is agile and relevant and can help you accelerate through the turn? Again, even in terms of innovation, there have been organisations that have been hugely innovative. We've seen the way in which people provide services have changed instantly. Some turned organisations around in days within the week. So how can we continuously innovate? As leaders, what are the skills that we need to develop to be innovative? And that takes us back to the curiosity. So why do we do things that way? Is there a different way of doing that? Just because we've always done it doesn't mean that it's effective. And empathy is, the survey from Corn Ferry identified that 69% of leaders had shown more empathy in the crisis, and that's huge. So it's have shown more empathy. People have liked that. I think what we find is organisations have done well. Some organisations have done well through this crisis. And we've got to ask the question is, why did that happen? And if we've got our people in our organisation who are more productive, they feel trusted, that is because of the leadership behaviours. So even going back to the way we did things before, many believed that working from home wasn't an option. We weren't perhaps empathetic to the position that people were in and the need for greater flexibility in terms of how they worked. But now we know that it works. The argument for saying it doesn't in the future has started to diminish. So how can I be more empathetic? And that is one of the critical skills then for leaders. In terms of developing those behaviours as leaders, what I wanted to do is share with you Thomas International's TQ assessment framework. So here we have the framework shows 4 really key areas. So you'll see in terms of the colour coding, happiness, optimism and self-esteem are the well-being factors. The emotional regulation, impulse control and stress management are the self-control factors. We've got the emotionality factors in pink. And also we have got then the emotional management, assertiveness and social awareness being the sociability factors. And then we've got 2 independent factors is adaptability and self-motivation. So what this tool does is provides a questionnaire for managers to assess. Some of you definitely on the call will have participated in this. So feel free in the chat box to maybe let others know how you feel about this particular tool. So it assesses your view of yourself in terms of these 15 facets. It is registered and validated by the British Psychological Society. It was developed by University College London and owned by them. And so what you can do is you can assess empathy being in there. Those are some of the critical behaviours that we've talked about for leaders moving forward. Where are you at the moment? Do you have an average supply, an oversupply or an undersupply? And where are your areas of development? Where are your strengths? So in this sample, what we see here is perhaps assertiveness being in the 23 percentile. So that would be something that this particular leader may want to develop. Emotional management is the ability to manage other people's emotions, not your own, because emotional regulation is your ability to manage your own emotions. Emotional perception, again, in this profile, is your ability to read your own and other people's emotions. I think that's critical in today's world. How am I feeling? How am I responding to those feelings? And what impact is that having on others? Because we need to understand ourselves so that we understand how we impact on others. So this is a really useful tool to assess where you are at the moment and then develop your areas moving forward. You can see at the bottom of your screen, I have a little button there for click now to find out more information about the TQ. There's a very detailed report that comes with this. So click there if you want to find out more information about that, or if you'd like to have a conversation about that later on, then please do get in touch. So what I wanted to do, those of you that have been at these webinars before will know that I use both the ACT matrix and the pro-social matrix developed by Dr. Kevin Polk. And the matrix really looks at 4 key areas. So if I start with the vertical line, the top we've got the 5 senses experience, and at the bottom the internal experiences. So at the bottom, what internal experiences show up at the top of the matrix, the 5 senses. So what would I see or hear you doing in terms of experiences? And then we've got the away and towards moves. What are we doing to move us towards our shared purpose as an organisation? In this case, the pro-social is talking about we. So what are we doing to move us towards our shared purpose? And on the other side, what might we be doing that moves us away from our shared purpose? And in the middle of the matrix, we've got that it's us noticing the difference, because sometimes we simply just don't notice. So if I think about what I've been talking about so far, and this is where I would like you to get involved in the chat box, is the question in the bottom left of the pro-social matrix is, what is our shared purpose? So that's something that we've continued to talk about. And what I'm doing now is starting to summarize what we've been talking about, put it in a framework to help you to take action. So if you were to simply draw on the page in front of you the matrix, and if you were in the bottom right to define what is our group's shared purpose. So as an organisation, what is our shared purpose? Perhaps in this case, if we're talking about leadership through the to achieve that thriving, meaningful organisation, what is our shared purpose? So it's to lead through uncertainty. What's important to the group in being led through that uncertainty? So I've provided here for a change some examples rather than asking you to do that. Feel free in the chat box to tell me anything that you believe that's important to a leadership group to lead through uncertainty that I haven't listed here. So things like decisiveness, agility, collaboration, innovation, empathy, trust, transparency, humility, candor, compassion, flexibility, self-care, and well-being. Anybody think of anything there that I've missed? But I'd like you to consider your own organisation and what we've talked about, and think about what is our shared purpose leading through this uncertainty, and what is important to the group. If we then move into the bottom left of the matrix, I may have said bottom left earlier when I meant bottom right. So if we're still in the internal experiences, and the question then, so what shows up in team members? In this case, it's the leadership team that gets in the way of achieving the shared purpose. So we're going to lead through uncertainty. What might show up in leaders that takes us away from achieving that shared purpose? And those are things like anxiety, despair about the situation that we're in. Many organizations are finding themselves in challenging positions. Fear about the uncertain future. Feeling overwhelmed by the pace that we're having to move at, which may also then leave some leaders feeling stressed and burnt out, because many people had not until this point been taking any leave. And I'll hold that thought and come back to it. Some may be feeling grief, may not be grief for people, but it may be, because there will be people that may have lost loved ones through this, but it might be grief for what's been lost, the organisation that they'd lost, the way that we did things before that has been lost. And therefore some people may also be feeling powerless and helpless, and some may really be feeling depressed. And in terms of human behaviour then, it's important to understand that for every internal experience, there is an external response. And so if we move into the top left here and say, well, what behaviours or actions might we see within leadership teams that come as a result of the internal experiences? Those are things that we do to get rid of those feelings. And so for some leaders, it might be do nothing. Well, let's do nothing at the moment. Let's sit and wait and see what's happening. And then we can respond at a later point. It might be about avoiding essential conversations. So what I have seen, again, I've said in recent months, is organisations having conversations about things that they were perhaps fearful of having before, but having now. I also talked about people feeling overwhelmed and stressed and burnt out. So while I don't have it here on my list, what I do have is the people working longer hours, people sending maybe emails outside of working hours. The need to keep working because people can't draw boundaries because they're at home. The computer's always accessible. It's easy to do 5 minutes, and 5 minutes becomes an hour, or it becomes 2 hours. And one of the things that we find is perhaps then an away move for a leader might be not taking breaks, not taking leave. I think it's essential at this point that people start to take leave, because 4 months is a long time to be operating at the speed and pace that we've been working at. So there may have been in the past, an away move could be a focus on tasks, as we said, rather than the focus on the outputs or the outcomes, I should say. Leaders might be ranting about the situation that we're in and when this might come to an end and the position that it's put everyone in. And also leaders might get distracted. They may not focus on tasks because of the internal experiences. And they may complain. The ranting and complaining could fall into the same area. So if we move over into the towards moves, what have we identified that through this webinar? What is the research telling us that we need to do to move us towards the shared purpose and what's important? So it's perhaps review or redefine your purpose for the organisation, pulling that out, referring to that more often, having conversations and really listening to your people about what's working at the minute and why, and what hasn't worked and why. So what have we changed and done differently, and what impact is that having? And as leaders, we need to be not only physically, but we need to be emotionally present. We need to use the emotional literacy, the emotional perception that I talked about in the TQ. We need to try to understand how people are feeling. We need to tune into that, or we need to ask people that. And then we need to look at how can we support those individuals. Because what we've said is our people are key in terms of delivery of the service. Very early in the pandemic, we found that our absence rates were higher because if there was any doubt that somebody had COVID, they were self-isolating. So some people's workforces reduced by as much as half or perhaps more. So how can we help and support people tuning into that emotional perception, understanding how people feel, providing the support mechanisms for people in terms of mental well-being, agreeing those short-term business priorities. What is our area of focus? Aligning our structure and our capabilities in terms of the priorities, and also, in terms of the purpose and the priorities. And discuss health, safety and well-being with the team. Some of you, I think most of the people on the webinar today are from Northern Ireland. Those of you will perhaps know of the recent outbreak as a result of a party in an area. And now understand that a shop in the area now, the people in the local community will not go into the shop because somebody who contracted COVID works there. So the need to discuss the health, safety and well-being of your team is so critical, because your people's actions may impact on the survival of the organisation and the health and well-being of others in the organisation. Therefore, we're back to psychological safety again. So those conversations are essential. And those of you who want to visit Crowdcast and maybe watch some of my earlier webinars on that, that might also be useful. Measure outcomes, not outputs, and keep conversations going. We've started conversations on a more regular basis. Those are much more effective. How do we consider keeping those as effective moving forward? Chat boxes has been quiet. That's perhaps been as a result of how I've conducted the webinar. And I would be interested in your views and opinions. So for me, you've taken the time out to attend this webinar this morning. We're into 12:02. So if those of you that are watching live, if you could put in the chat box for me, and maybe one of the things that you've taken from this that you're going to perhaps take action on after the end of the webinar this week, next week. So I'd love to hear what one thing are you going to do going away from this? Just going to check no questions in the ask a question box. Just as I'm waiting on you typing, I'd like to thank you for attending. I hope that you have found the information that I have provided relevant and useful for you. I've provided the get in touch here, details of the website. The get in touch, or the click here at the bottom of your screen, will take you right through to my website if you want details on some leadership development. Email address I've provided, and also some of the QR codes there if you'd like to follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Anybody willing to let me know one thing that you're going to change or you're going to go away and do as a result of this webinar? Love to hear from you. Okay, so stress the importance with our leaders of showing vulnerability and leadership as they become emotional battering rams for staff who have been stressed and overwhelmed. It's been a huge job for leaders. Leaders are vulnerable, and they are just like any other people. I think that's a great one. I think looking at how priorities have to shift rather than sticking religiously to the plan. Many plans may be completely out of date. So I think it is important that we stick with the purpose. If I take you back to the reinventing organizations, one of the things in terms of purpose is about sensing and responding. So if we're riding a bicycle, we will sense and respond to the conditions on the road. And that is what we need to do with our purpose, is to sense and respond what is going on. Yeah, our people are key, absolutely. Lorraine is on the webinar, and I did mention well-being earlier. So if you're interested in some well-being packages, get in touch. I'll connect you with Lorraine, who is from Corporate Benefits, and they have some very cost-effective healthcare benefits for your people, and have a free website also that can provide some valuable resources. So get in touch if you want that, and I'll connect you with Lorraine. I've definitely run into your time. It's 12:05. Thank you so much for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Take care, stay well, look after your own self-care. Consider what that might look like. Look forward to seeing you again. All the best. Bye.